quotes there. So all of this combined positivity around Manchester naturally begs the question of Manchester's place on the global stage as an international gateway city. So without further ado, I'll introduce our panel for today. So we have Giles Barrie, who's going to moderate, Sir Howard, who needs no further introduction, John Hughes, Managing Director of Ask Real Estate, Ruairidh Jackson, Senior Projects Director at Argent, who arrived 20 minutes ago on his bike, and also Anthony Leonard, Managing Director at Hines UK. Many thanks.
Okay, do you want to, guys? Okay, so Manchester as a international investment proposition. And again, Rory has just cycled 1,400 miles since Thursday to get to us. He hasn't just arrived on his bike. He's been going since Thursday. He's come all the way through France and certainly knows... certainly knows about Manchester as an investment proposition. So, again, thanks, Monica. But to kick off, I, as you said, am Giles Barrie. I, until 3 years ago, was editor of Property Week, and I've now moved to the dark side of financial PR, and we were delighted to work with Nabarro on this piece of research, which was in its third year. And it's not just last year that Manchester came top of those 400 billion investors' investment intentions. It's every year we've done it. And it's fascinating. I've followed Sir Howard and his work in Manchester for up to 20 years now. And he always seems to be ahead of the game. There always seems to be something new up his sleeve. And it'd be interesting to hear what ideas he's working on next. Because there are some storm clouds swirling around UK property at the moment, as we know. We've got a tough budget promised tomorrow. Brexit, or Remain, as people call it, seem to be the big talking point, a MIPIM. And what we need to know now, I think, is how does Manchester stay ahead of the game? So we're going to interview the team first, and then we want to hear your questions from the panel, from the floor as well. So let's start with the biggest question. So Howard, how can Manchester make itself more attractive to overseas investors, given the slightly uncertain scenario that we have right away?
Well, I think for us, it's doing more of the same. Where we've been over the last couple of years, we've established a platform for not just national but international investment. Then that's a reflection of a number of things: value for money, which is very important, capacity to get things done, being business friendly, access to skills, and bringing forward what we would describe as market-facing propositions. And I think we understand the sequencing of change. I think we have a deep understanding of the economics of how the city functions, and by continuing in that vein, by also demonstrating our own investment capability, by demonstrating, giving business confidence that we're also prepared to invest, we can engender real confidence. And a number of things coming through the pipeline now gives us all, I think, real confidence that over the next few years we should go from strength to strength.
I was at the Manchester-Liverpool breakfast this morning. I was interested in what you said about how people who had been looking at London and are now looking at Manchester and other cities. Can, just for those who weren't there this morning, just explain what you're seeing in that?
I think there are two key influences on investment trends. One is the fact that cities like Manchester, and we're not the only ones, I know, bringing forward compelling investment propositions, which is attracting increasing international attention, helped obviously by the priority which government is placing on the overall Northern Powerhouse strategy. And at the same time, other investors who otherwise would have seen London, its natural home for investment, effectively being crowded out, either because of the general overheating that's taking place within the London economy, or their inability to access value for doing the deal. So that combination of factors is I think, working in favour of places like Manchester.
And over the years, we've seen regeneration, going back to post Arndale in the 90s, right the way through to a focus on tech, and it's now science seems to be one of the big talking points, or the big points you're promoting. Again, can you just explain how that might appeal to overseas investors? So, from a property perspective, it's not immediately apparent, but what's your thinking behind that?
Well, I think, first of all, progressive cities who are going to be successful in the global market have to be cities that's firing on more than one cylinder. You've got to have a deep and wide business space. So I think that's point number one. In the 90s, I think Manchester was synonymous with growth in commercial and professional services. That's important and will continue to be important. What we've seen, certainly over the last decade or more, is not just a growth in traditional sectors, but advanced manufacturing, creative industries, digital, life science, advanced materials, all of which help to create that wider platform, which is not only important for growing our economy, but is also important for trading with international territories. Because we have to recognise, well, Manchester was founded on trade, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. What we've got to do in order to support our growth and our development is actually be competitive and productive, and as well as being very strong in international markets.
Anthony, Hines is an international investor, and you've arrived in Manchester. But what more can be done to make it appeal to overseas investors, do you think?
I agree that it's more of the same. It's funny because we haven't actually invested much in Manchester. We've done a lot in the regional cities, but not Manchester. And if you told me that 5 years ago, it would have amazed me, because Manchester was top of our list for everything we look for in a city. So, I mean, I'm looking at this from the point of view of developing office space mainly. But so we need opportunities to invest in. And I think of all the regional cities, the development community in the city of Manchester have created the most schemes, best located. You know, that there's far more opportunities for us to invest in Manchester than elsewhere. In terms of then filling up that space, if you look at the number of new occupiers coming to Manchester, the take-up that's happened in the last few years, it's far ahead of other regional cities. And finally, the thing we really need in the city is, when we're trying to appeal to international investors, is that they're going to want to come and see the city, and it needs to be easy to get to and look nice when you walk around it. And Manchester really delivers. And, I mean, we did a lot in Birmingham back in 2010, 11, and getting off the train at New Street investors was you saw the look of panic in their eyes as they saw the station. You saw their heart was sinking, and you had to try and convince them that was the whole city wasn't like that. And Manchester doesn't have that problem. Manchester looks great. You know, everyone who we've brought to Manchester has loved it. So I think it's more of the same. And
is there anything that, if there was one thing that could be better, what would it be? What would you like to see done?
We would like to have fewer investors trying to invest in Manchester, because it's too competitive for us. That's the real challenge. Being serious, no one thing. It's got all the ingredients we want. It's top of our list of places we want to invest.
How, just before we move on to the next one, what would you like to improve most? I mean, you're always setting yourself new challenges. What would you like the city to see done? See do it itself doing better?
Luke, I'd like us to see the city functional again, but there's an inevitable process when you're building railways to a city centre that you're going to have problems around congestion and functionality. So, I think TFGM have done a remarkable job to keep all of that to programme. So next year we'll see a very, very different city centre, fully functional again. We've all got ambitions about development, but I think one of the things we've got right is the sequencing of development. The things we're doing today we could never have done 5 years ago. And I think that's very, very important. And the things we're going to be doing in 5 years' time, I hope we're going to be things which naturally follow on from all the stuff which we're doing today. But the combination of assets, the way in which we've harnessed those assets to support the overall growth of the city region is, I think, a very, very strong platform for us to continue to build.
Okay. So I talked about Brexit at the beginning, and it's something that, as I said, just today at MIPIM, you can't get away from. I'm going to ask the developers what their take is on that and how that might affect inward investment to Manchester if we were to leave. Ruairidh, you've just cycled through France, as I say. What's your take on whether we should stay or leave, and if we were to leave, how would that affect inward investment to the city?
Well, we had a sort of Argent business school thing a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about this down in London with the partners. And we had a show of hands at the end as to who thought Brexit was a good idea. No hands went up. Who wanted to stay? Everyone put their hand up. And then everyone was able to say, oh yeah, but I know so-and-so, and they think we should leave, kind of thing. The two people that presented to that group, it was quite interesting. One was a fund manager. So they were looking for stability, long-term income. They thought Brexit was terrible. It's 7 years' worth of instability is not a good thing. And the other was a hedge fund manager who loves instability and then thought it was a great idea. So I think from our point of view, we would not like to see wouldn't like to see change, particularly when unless something's changed in the last couple of days and I haven't heard about it, the arguments for Brexit, there's no consistent reason to do it. There's lots of people coalescing around an idea, all of whom think it's going to do something slightly different for them. Whereas staying, at least you know what you're getting. So from our point of view, I think we're very much of the view that it would be unhelpful and might spend 7-8 years negotiating individual trade agreements with everyone and end up in a worse place than we started with, and no one can tell us.
That would be a slowdown in the property market and of money coming into cities like Manchester.
Slowdown in the property market. I mean, you're already seeing future trading on the pound is predicting that the pound's going to go down, weaken against the dollar in May as we get closer to the election. So. That's just a foretaste of the kind of things that could happen. I don't think people would want to take a jump in somewhere where they didn't know what was going. From a Manchester perspective as well, I think, certainly in my view, the Northern Powerhouse story and Devo Mank and the power being moved into Greater Manchester where better, more effective decision making can be made, that would be maybe sort of a counter negative to that if there was lots and lots of confusion at a national level. Investors make a decision at a country level first, and then they make a decision at a city level.
Yeah, interesting. And again, from this morning's Manchester-Liverpool session, I was struck by how Manchester is now seen as a properly European city, competing with its rivals, big rivals, Berlin, Paris, and the like, across the continent. John from Ask, what's your feeling on this Brexit point?
Yeah, I think I agree with what Rory just encapsulated there. I think actually what we need is, on the 24th of June, is a no to an exit. And what we need then is to move the debate away from centralisation of powers in London and capturing them back from Brussels to London, and actually moving forward and saying we need to devolve more powers to those regions that are capable of administering them in a sort of responsible way. And looking forward, I think we'll have these issues and the pound and currency, etc., between now and May and June. But I think after that, hopefully we can move on to something which is away from centralisation. I think there's a certain political persuasion that is so focused on this repatriation of powers to London because that's where they want them, and actually where we want them is in places like Greater Manchester.
And just Anthony, before we leave this point, what's your take on it?
Yeah, I agree with what everyone said. I think developers hate uncertainty. People won't develop if there's uncertainty. I think development won't stop completely, but I think there'll be a huge slowdown. But having said that, there's still a huge amount of capital out there that needs to be invested. And I think prime retail in particular, prime offices, asset classes such as student housing that are perhaps less affected, I think we're going to see people piling into those just because people still need to invest their money.
Yeah. You do get the feeling that if Britain remains in the EU after June, there could be an almighty uplift after 6 months of real uncertainty. You know, like before the election last year, but magnified several-fold, I think. So sticking with the devolution point, so Howard, where are we with that? And has it gone far enough? What do you want to see happening now?
Well, we've also got to assume some responsibility for delivering what we've already got, which is quite a challenge. Certainly where health and social care is concerned, we take full responsibility for that next week, and we've got to stop talking and start doing, really. And we're all very confident of making significant progress there. I think that the overall devolution thing for me is now about continuing the focus on customising particular asks and functions around places which are able to administer them, places which are able to evidence the interrelationship between those functions and where they are in their own growth and reform journey. So, you know, there has been a little, well, some signs perhaps where the system has started to fight back because inevitably when you go through what we've been through, not everyone was delighted in central government with the devolution deals. So the way the system has started to fight back is to try and standardise. Well, Sheffield have got this, why won't you accept it? Or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, the reason why we're not accepting some of that stuff is because it's not particularly relevant to the journey we're on and the priorities which we have and which we need to develop. So I think that is going to be, I think, an increasingly important principle which all of us need to adhere to. And I think the final one is making some step changes towards fiscal devolution. Business rates is a hot topic at the moment. Hopefully might be some news over the next few weeks about that. But it seems to me that if we are going to make business rates work, this shouldn't be an administrative process. It needs to be a process which is also geared to those places having the capacity to grow their economy and therefore grow their business base. And the more we can demonstrate through the right incentives that we can grow our business base, the stronger we're going to be, not just in financial terms, but the stronger we're going to be in growth terms as well.
And given we're less than 24 hours now from George Osborne's latest budget, what's top of your wish list for that, and what would help Manchester most, do you think?
I think further progress in those sorts of areas, to be honest. I think, you know, we've made some big gains over the last couple of years. I think we're more likely to see a series of incremental steps. You know, there could be another devolution agreement on the table over the next couple of days. We'll have to wait and see. He's got to stand up and make his speech. But we want to see more of the same, but more specifically focused around our particular needs and priorities.
Okay. I want to talk about housing a bit now, because every city you talk to at the moment, every big city you talk to, sees it as a major problem. And private rented sector obviously has arrived in Manchester in part. But does the infrastructure exist in terms of housing for Manchester to continue to grow and attract inward investment? Starting with the developers. John, what needs to be done to attract inward investment and keep the success story going in a housing sense for Manchester?
I think just looking at the PRS, the city centre living sector first, some of the tip of everyone's tongue at the moment, everyone's talking about it. I think in terms of where that's going to go and the market leaders in that, we'll not know that for another 2 to 3 years when the pipeline starts to actually be completed. But I think it's important for inward investors in terms of businesses, because it demonstrates that there will be high quality accommodation in central locations in the city region in Manchester, where their staff and that labour supply that they so badly want can be located close to work. So that's the city centre piece. I think in terms of the suburbs, others will be more qualified than me in terms of the house building supply. I do know from living where I live in just South Manchester in Didsbury, there are significant investment in new family housing accommodation, which has been needed for many years, and that's starting to come through. And I think that will again serve to assure and persuade businesses coming to Manchester that accommodation will be provided.
Rory, I want to ask you about this. I mean, I think it's fascinating. If you go to the London stand, so I'm sure some of you have been there, there's swathes of residential towers there, and you do wonder how many people are going to be living in a lot of these. What can Manchester, do you think, learn from London as it looks to increase its housing supply and actually get people living in new build homes?
Well, I mean, when I see some of the appraisals that come through to justify some of the larger scale high-rise buildings in Manchester, the way that is put through to a land value for asking price when we're looking to buy sites, I think that there's still quite an imbalance in expectation with landowners, perhaps looking for higher value for their land than the schemes can really justify. So I think the higher rise buildings are still going to be a challenge. I know that some people are going to be looking at how to make them work, and once someone cracks it, then that'll be great. But right now, I think that's still a challenge. So the supply number that you see, the proportion of that which is in very expensive pound per square foot apartment buildings of very tall towers, which would drive a certain type of rent in order to justify it as a financially viable proposition, does mean that they're focusing on a very limited demographic of high-income professionals sharing. Now that's really important in terms of creating the population, a highly skilled population, to support businesses within the city centre, but it's a very small part of the overall housing need. So I think that when you look at the numbers, there's a bit to flush out really as to whether everyone is targeting the same relatively small number of people. In London, we're seeing a correction, so we just have to see how that works through. But it is quite a different market. I don't think there's necessarily many good lessons to learn from the high-end stuff in London, but we'll have to see on that. I think John's point about family housing is really important.
I'd be really interested to see your take on this, because there hasn't been really a shortage of housing being built in London. It's just, is it the right type of housing? And you have the benefit of being able to look on and see what's happened. What lessons do you think can be learned, and how will Manchester approach correcting its housing supply?
Well, I think the first point really is that you need a multifaceted response to housing, and it needs to be focused around a functional economic area. At the moment, I think you've got 33 housing policies largely around London, which is a reflection of the priorities of individual boroughs. And I think, therefore, what you're always getting is not always an aligned response to the priorities of London. That position is confounded, particularly those of us outside London, where national policy is overly dominated by the experience of London. So the priorities of London around socially rented sector, around affordable homes, is the national priorities. And quite frankly, for us, starter homes is another, I think the latest initiative. When we talk about a functional housing market in Greater Manchester, it's really about rethinking the role of the socially rented sector. It's also supporting brownfield development, where we all know the cost of remediation of infrastructure provision doesn't always match up to the initial costs of bringing that development into the market. It also requires more intelligent use of all the opportunities for securing wider home ownership. And it also involves a clearer perspective about the balance between greenfield, brownfield as part of a strategic spatial framework plan. None of that is, in my view, is characterised by the London approach, as a result of which what you get is lots of examples of high-rise development fueled by foreign investment patterns where nobody lives in them. And as somebody's already said, is focused on a very, very narrow part of the market. And finally, for Manchester, it's also about maintaining the highest standards around quality of provision. We're very conscious of the way in which PRS has suddenly taken hold of this, within parts of the city, and in principle that's to be welcome, because that will meet the need of a changing younger population, which is already evidenced within the city. But the schemes that will really succeed are the ones that place quality of provision, amenity and quality of management at the fore. And some of the projects which we're directly involved in will achieve those standards. I'm not convinced that everyone will, however.
Okay. And my last question is around tech occupiers. One thing I'm curious about is there a place in Manchester that could be defined as a tech cluster? Is there a place that everyone can migrate to? Should one be created? Perhaps Ruairidh, what's your feeling about that?
Every business is a tech business these days in one way or another. We need the high-quality fibre capacity infrastructure in a city in order to make it successful for financial professional services, media, advanced materials, all the core business themes and areas that Manchester's strong on. Tech specifically, I actually think that put the sort of media thing of Media City one side, which is great and very successful. There is a really interesting and rich diversity of small businesses in Manchester, in the Northern Quarter, and areas like that, which are doing really interesting tech stuff, working on apps and providing a lot of high technology and gaming as well. It's a real growth area. So I think Manchester's doing it well. It's perhaps not got the tech city branding that Silicon Roundabout or whatever in London has, but I don't know if that's necessarily the thing there. So
before we open up to the floor, Howard, what do you think? Do you feel the need for a kind of branded tech cluster that people from around the world flock to, or you're happy with it being disparate?
I think how we promote ourselves as a tech city is different from how technological-based businesses actually allow to cluster. My sense is that clusters should be encouraged to develop wherever they want to develop. And one of the things I've learned over the last few years is that you can't be spatially focused around particular parts of the city where tech activity is concerned. I think the priority for us going forward is about how we drive the ecosystem around skills development, in particular how we develop a much stronger mentoring capacity, particularly for young or incubative tech-based businesses, how they access finance. We're pretty good at, largely as a result of the investment models we ourselves have developed for giving people the essential start. But, whether the traditional finance system actually supports businesses who have shown potential to move up to the next 2 or 3 ladders, I think, is an open question. And finally, by developing a pluralist approach to provision, which it can be, sheds where containers can go in, as opposed to, tech-based businesses who can pay £20 plus a square foot. We need it all. And our role, I think, in the city, working with our different partners, is to support the entry side of the debate and create the conditions necessary for businesses to flourish.
Okay, let's throw the floor open to the audience now on what Manchester needs to do to attract overseas investment. Who wants to ask the first question? I'm not going to crack. Who's it going to be? Mark.
Currently, about 30% of investment activity in Manchester is from overseas investors. The other 70% is a mix of UK institutions and private money. Do the panel think that there is scope to increase that 30% to a significantly higher proportion, or do you think that we should be happy with what we have and grow the overall size of the marketplace?
I think I might ask Anthony first, who's already feels it's a very competitive market.
I think that in the short term, just because of the way the world is right now, it's going to be tough to get international investors to invest. Since last summer, we've noticed a real change in the market, but the market will come back, and absolutely, I think a lot of investors that we talk to they can't see value in London, and that is where obviously the majority of overseas investment has been headed. So if London is no longer seen as an alternative because it's too expensive, then to me, cities like Manchester are exactly where, or cities like Manchester should be going to these investors and bringing them in. I mean, that's already happening, but absolutely, I think there should be more investment.
Okay, so Howard?
I think it's both. I think, first of all, it's increasing the total size of the cake, which is obviously important. I think the figures you gave earlier today, what was it, 6 or 8 billion in the north of England. I think over the next 5 years we should be able to at least double that. You know, what proportion that will contain in terms of international investment, I think, you know, 30% should at least be 50%. You know, there's no evidence, at least which is being displayed to me, that, you know, the problem or the so-called problems of China at the moment are in any way at all doing anything other than intensifying the requirement for diversification of investment. And by nature of the inquiries we're receiving day by day, I feel very confident that we can improve on that proportion, certainly over the next 12 months.
Okay, who's got one more question? Who wants to ask one before we... Everyone's a bit weary. Okay, over here.
With upward pressure on prime rents in the city, office rents within the city, moving rents to levels of certain outer London boroughs, etc., is the cost-effective nature of the labour in Manchester enough to maintain the competitive advantage within the city, or should we be doing more? Should we be doing different things?
That's an interesting one. John?
Yeah, okay. Hughes Ewan said earlier today about the cost of living or cost of accommodation for a PwC graduate in London is 60% of their monthly take-home pay goes to the cost of living, obviously, and outside of London, so let's assume Manchester, it's 20-25%. I think while that differentiation is still apparent, it's not going to narrow any time soon, I don't think. There will still be those big advantages to move labour and attract labour in cities like Manchester. So I think as well, if you look at the actual true rents achieved in the city centre, and then compare those to the rents in the city or even the West End, there is still a significant 50-100% differentiation. So, and property is still a small proportion of a business cost. It's obviously a growing proportion, but it's still a small proportion. So I don't see that being an issue, certainly for Manchester, because of its diversity in its skills and its labour supply.
Anthony, I'll leave it to you to say the last thing. As you're doing your appraisals on whether to buy or where and what to buy in Manchester, does so-called North Shoring come into it? Do you think there's potential for relocations from public or private sector to come up here, or is that gap narrowing too much, do you think?
No, not at all. I mean, frankly, that was a big part of our rationale for investing in regional cities. So there's this huge push factor, because London has always been expensive, but during the good times, companies were happy to pay for that. What we have now is London getting more and more expensive, but the government and corporates really desperate to cut their costs. So I think there's a real push to move out of London to more affordable locations. And we've seen that with the buildings we've developed, that both of the big developments within Birmingham were taken by big corporates moving people out of London.
Okay. So, Hope, do you want to sum up everything to Howard now on why Manchester should still be seen as a hot prospect for overseas investment?
I think it's pretty clear, me. I think we have a diversity of provision. Our business space is deeper and wider than most. We have a transport plan. We ourselves have invested heavily in transport. Government is now following suit, which is going to help immeasurably the connectivity of the city and therefore widen our catchment area. We have assets around research and innovation and science which stand comparison with any institution anywhere in the world, particularly in certain sectors. We have civic leadership in GM as well as in Manchester, which recognises what we do better than most. We invest, and I think we're business friendly and deliver. And when you add all of those things together, I think it's a pretty potent and powerful combination of assets and activities. But we're also sufficiently realistic to know, when we're pushing the boat out slightly too far, always understand is lesson number one. Always understand what the market wants, where the market wants to go, and our role is to help the market deliver on its own ambitions.
Okay. Right, I'm now going to hand back to Monica. I think that's been a fascinating session. Lots of detailed conjecture and discussion against a slightly uncertain environment. Monica, can I hand back to you? Thank you.
Thank you, Giles. So there's been a real theme throughout the session around Manchester, and more of the same, I think, is what's come out very strongly. We have a very strong platform, and we hear lots of words around productivity, growth, alignment, and support. Contrast that with an out vote and Brexit, and we see instability, which we don't want. We don't want to see Brussels substituted for London, and we certainly don't want our devolution to be commoditised. It's been a long day, so all I've left to do is to thank our panel for their words and wisdom. So if you join me in thanking them.
If it makes no difference.